Hello, welcome to Our Lady's Bible Study, Seamless. We're going through a summary through the whole story of the Bible, and we left off last week talking about Isaac and Ishmael. I just want to review quickly our little chart that we're using. This was the first section we talked about, the beginning, and in the beginning the 5 divisions that we mentioned were creation, Adam and Eve, the fall, Noah's Ark, and the Tower of Babel. And now we're in the second big section, the patriarchs, the leaders or the heads of the Israelite nation. And the first section was this megaphone picture. It's the call of Abram. The second section, which is where we are today, is this name tag, and it is Abram's name being changed to Abraham, which means father of many nations. So we haven't gotten to these ones yet. We will get to them. We're just taking some time. There's a lot of stuff to cover in Abraham's life, and we're moving through it. But last week we left off talking about Isaac and Ishmael. We kind of mentioned very briefly that there was conflict between them even as children. We know that after Isaac was born, Ishmael must have been around 14 years old, 15 years old, and Sarah sees him mocking her son, her baby son, and she does end up sending them out. But even in that, the Lord lets Hagar know, Ishmael's mother, that he is with her as a person, and he's still going to make of her son a great nation, as was promised to Abraham and to his descendants. And Ishmael was Abraham's son, and so the Lord told Hagar, I am going to keep that promise. Ishmael will have a great nation come from him as well, and we know that that is the Arab nation. And there is still conflict between the Arab people and the Israelite or Israeli or Jewish people. And that all started way back here with, I like how the book puts it, with one father and 2 mothers. And interpersonal relationships can be pretty messy, and you don't see perfect people in the Bible. The only perfect person who's ever lived is Jesus. But all the other people that the Bible mentions, although there may be stuff that we should copy or stuff that we should avoid in their lives, none of them are going to be perfect. And the Bible, I think, tends to be pretty good at presenting a realistic view of how people's lives were, the stuff they did, and we've said it several weeks in a row, but just because the Bible says something happened doesn't mean it's recommending that you act likewise. And so in the case, with this case of one father and 2 mothers, the Bible is not advocating polygamy. It's just telling you what happened. Culturally, it may have been more acceptable back then than it is now, but it causes problems still. Okay, moving along. We are to Genesis 22. We're going to talk about the sacrifice of Isaac. Genesis 22:1 says, it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here am I. So God calls Abraham again, or calls out to him, and Abraham says, I'm here. I'm here for you. What you need, God? I'm your man. But we can see already this word. It's an interesting word in that verse. God did tempt Abraham. When we hear the word tempt in our 21st century English, and certainly even it's not news to the 21st century, we think of trying to get somebody to do wrong. James talks about that kind of tempting, and it's very clear from James chapter 1. Let me turn there. James chapter 1, verse 13 and 14, the Bible says, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So this is pretty clear. God doesn't tempt you, and this passage is specifically talking about to sin. God isn't setting you up to fall. God isn't putting obstacles in your path to try to get you to sin. There are tests that God will give to a believer, and that is the context of this verse in Genesis 22. That word that is used in that section in the Old Testament means to test, to try, to prove, to put to the proof. It doesn't mean to try to get him to fail. It just means kind of to see what he's made of. to see. And there is a difference between those two things. And God here is putting a test in Abraham's life. Now, just saying God isn't tempting him in the sense that we think of tempting today, like trying to get him to sin, doesn't mean that it was easy. And I think that's obvious if you think about this situation. We didn't keep reading, but let's continue. Genesis 22:2, and God said, "Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." What? This is new. This is weird. This is not what I expected. We don't have Abraham's thoughts recorded here for us, but can you imagine? He just went through this whole mess with trying to help God out and, coming up with a son on their own wisdom, Ishmael, who did, bring some extra conflict into their lives that if they had just waited for God's timing wouldn't have been an issue. But now he has Isaac. He has the one God promised, and Isaac is older by this time. We don't know exactly how old he was, but he was old enough to carry stuff up a mountain with his dad. We read in this section. But now God is telling him, I want you to go offer him to me as a sacrifice on an altar. This wasn't something that God's people did. What's going on here? Is God trying to get him to sin? The Bible is clear that God was putting a test before him. And we can see as we read further down what the test was, but let's just keep going through this. This was a situation, I just want to say, this was a situation that didn't make sense to Abraham. We know what Abraham's overall response was based on this passage, and also the New Testament tells us more about Abraham believed God, but it was just a weird situation, and I imagine that you and I have and will in the future also find ourselves in weird situations where you're like, this isn't what I had pictured for something that God would do. In my mind, this isn't something that God says or God does. Am I saying that God's going to ask you to offer your child on an altar? No, I am not saying that. I am saying that we might be asked to give up some things that are pretty near and dear to our hearts. And we may not understand what God is doing, and we may not see how this is going to work out. But here in this situation, the very next verse, Genesis 22, verse 3, tells us, Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass, his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. He gets up early in the morning, it says, and he just starts out on the way to obey God. Can I understand this? As a human, I have a hard time with this story. And I have a hard time with this kind of a test on a personal level, like me as a human being, I struggle with this. I don't know. This is kind of crazy. This is what did I say in our Zoom class? This is hardcore. But I like that the book points out here why. Why would a loving and kind God ask a man to kill his own son? And this leads us to another question. Why would God sacrifice his own son, his only begotten son, whom he loves? I want to point out that in verse 2, God mentions your only son, Isaac, who you love. This is the first time that the word love is even used in the Bible, and it's talking to the love of a father for his son. Transition. Anything seem familiar about the love of a father for his son and the sacrifice of a son, the giving up of a son for somebody else's greater good? That is what God did for us with Jesus. That was Jesus. Jesus was a willing sacrifice. Jesus was God, but he was also a human on earth, 100% man and 100% God. Interestingly, Isaac had to carry his own wood up the mountain. We didn't read those verses, but we see that Isaac carried the bundle of wood. And 2,000 years later or so, on this same mountain range, according to history, in this same area, on Calvary, Jesus carried his cross up Mount Calvary. God sacrificed his only son for us. And he was asking Abraham to do this, to sacrifice his only son. Did Abraham believe he was going to have to sacrifice his son? According to the Bible, yes, he did. Hebrews 11, verse 19. This is talking about Abraham. It's in the middle of a section. This chapter, Hebrews 11, is a lot of times called the Hall of Faith because it talks about faithful men and women and their great faith that they had in God. And this particular section is talking about Abraham. It says, I'll just read verses 17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. Interesting wording there, the same wording that the Bible uses to talk about Jesus. I'm not saying Isaac was Jesus. I'm saying it's a picture. So verse 18, his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. So Abraham, according to Hebrews, he was willing to offer his son at God's direction, knowing or believing or understanding that this is the son that God promised me, who he said I'm going to be made into a great nation through this son. He's going to die. I'm going to kill him. God will raise him up from the dead if he has to, or God will stop me or whatever. But here it says he believed, if necessary, God would bring him back from the dead. That's I don't know. That's a hardcore level of faith that I have already admitted to you. I have a hard time with this story. But I like that it says Abraham knew he served a trustworthy God. If God asked me to sacrifice my son, would I be thinking of God as trustworthy? I don't know. But Abraham knew enough about God. He didn't know everything that we know. He didn't have the whole Bible. But he apparently knew enough to believe that God was trustworthy enough to keep his promise and to do whatever it took to fulfill that promise. We see, if you read on in the story in Genesis 22, that right as Abraham has built the altar, he's got his son up on there, he says he has the knife in his hand, and the angel of the Lord stops him, calls him again and says, Abraham, and he says, here am I, the same thing he said at the beginning. Yeah, I'm here. What's up? It's me. I'm Abraham. I'm ready to do whatever you want, God. God calls him and stops him. And he says, don't kill him. I'll just read it because I don't want to put words in God's mouth. It says in Genesis 22, verse 12, and he, God, or the angel of the Lord, said, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. We see, as you read down through that chapter, that Abraham looks up and, oh, coincidentally, there is a ram caught in the thicket. Oh, the angel of the Lord tells him, you should sacrifice that ram to me instead of your son. Big sigh of relief. But Abraham calls the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, another name of the Lord, and it means the Lord will provide, the Lord my provider. God provided a substitute for Isaac in this situation, in this hardcore test, and God provided a substitute for us. He sent his son Jesus to die in our place. And this story is a picture of that. The Lord will provide many things. The Lord provides comfort, protection, food, shelter many times. He provides many things, but ultimately he provides salvation. He provided his son for us. And that is, we'll get back to that when we get to the New Testament, but this story is a clear picture of what Jesus was going to do for his people. A couple thousand years down the road from this story going on. Another thing that I noticed from this story that I want to mention just quickly is something that I've never heard it taught from this, but it was just standing out to me as I was thinking over this lesson in the days leading up to Sunday, to teaching this. And it's just a reminder to me that we can read this story, regardless of what your opinion of should God have put Abraham to that crazy of a test, or what was Abraham thinking, or I wouldn't have done it, or I would have, maybe God would, I don't know, whatever your thoughts are. We're looking back in time and reading the end of the story and seeing what God did and how it's a picture of what was going to happen. We're even looking back on Jesus Christ and that picture, and we can see the correlation, even the wording in the Bible, the only begotten son. We can see Abraham's faith, but Abraham didn't see any of that. Abraham, he was in the middle of this test. And when I'm in a test and when you're in a test, we're in the middle of it, and we can't see the outcome. We can't see how other people are going to look back and maybe be encouraged or helped. But just a reminder that not everything that happens to me or happens in my life, not everything is about me or even for me. Some of it is for other people. And there obviously was a part of this event in Abraham and Isaac's life that was for them. It was a test. The Bible clearly says God was testing Abraham. But there's also a big part of it that was for us to look back and to see how God provided and how that correlated to Jesus and how he provided his son for us. And even the name that he called out, God's name, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. That's for us. It was for Abraham too, but it's for us. And the Bible talks about that in 2 Corinthians 1:3-7-ish. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it just talks about, Paul is talking about how God comforts us, talking to the Christians in Corinth. God comforts us so that we can comfort other people. Whatever I'm going through, he talks about afflictions and tribulations. He said, if I'm being afflicted or if I'm going through a hard time, I know that this is going to in some way encourage you or give you strength in your hard time. Or if I'm being comforted or if I'm receiving encouragement from someone else or from the Lord, I know that that's so I can turn around and offer the same thing to someone else. It's happening to me. It's happening in my life. But the purpose is for somebody else. And it's a little bit of a stretch. I know it's not the same exact type of event, but just a reminder that some things happen in our lives and we may not see the end. We may not see the full picture, but we can know this is going to be good. There's going to be good that comes out of this. We know God works all things together for good to those who love God. Okay, so we see Isaac comes down the mountain with Abraham. Abraham calls the place Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide, and yes, God is in the providing business. Moving on, we're just fast forwarding through a couple years. We're not going to get much further, but we just mentioned briefly on Sunday, fast forwarding, Sarah, Abraham's wife, has died. She was already old. She's now passed away. Abraham is still alive. We actually read that Abraham gets married again, and I'm pretty sure the Bible says he has more kids. I don't have that in front of me, but he was super old, but apparently not too old because he kept going for a while. But he's got Isaac, and he wants to make sure that his son, Isaac, has a wife before Abraham, dies. And he doesn't want that wife to be from the Canaanite place where they're living now. Let me pull this map back out. Remember that they had started out in Ur of the Chaldees, which is over here in the crease of my book. And they had traveled up here to Haran, and this is where they had stopped, and Abram's father had died here. And eventually they had come back down here to Canaan, which is where God had wanted them to head toward, and they were here. But Abraham says, no, I want my son's wife to come from my family up there. I want it to be not one of these Canaanites who worship false gods and all this stuff. I want it to be somebody from my family. So he sends his servant up there. We're not going to get into really the details, but we do know that through a very, crazy enough, the right woman just happened to be right there, quote unquote. God worked it all out. The perfect person was right there waiting. When the servant got up to Haran, she agreed, the family agreed, she came back, she marries Isaac, and the Bible specifies that she's a comfort to him as he's mourning the death of his mother. Rebecca eventually gets pregnant, and it's twins, and she can feel the babies jostling around in her womb. She feels like they're fighting. She asks the Lord in Genesis 25:23, what is going on? Why does it feel like my two babies in my womb are fighting? And Genesis 25:23, the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. He basically tells her, it seems like they're fighting because they are, and they're gonna keep fighting after they're born too, even when they grow up. And it's gonna be all twisted up, messed up from what culture tells you and what the normal thing is. To us, it may not seem that big of a deal for the older brother to serve the younger brother, but culturally in that time, that was a big deal. That did not happen. That was not the way it worked out. We see the babies are born. Esau was born first, and we know he was a redhead, he was hairy, he was man's man, an outdoorsy guy. Maybe not when he was born, but he was hairy. And his brother Jacob is born right after him, grabbing onto his heel. As he comes out, he's got a hold of his brother's foot. And his name, Jacob, means heel grabber. It means the one who comes. I wrote down the definition. I don't have it in front of me. It's actually on my phone, which I'm using to record this. But it's the one who follows after or comes behind, and supplanter, which is the one who wrongfully takes the place of another. And a lot of times people will use the word deceiver as a definition for Jacob's name because of that idea of the wrongful taking the place. And we're going to see that next week. We're going to talk about, well, how did he wrongfully take somebody's place? Remember that in the Bible, names have meanings, and the meanings are significant. They're not just, my name happens to mean whatever. It has a significance in the person's life. So we see Jacob, who is going to be a heel grabber, grabbing on to what was in front of him, wrongfully taking the place of where, culturally he didn't belong. But God had said it was going to happen. So we'll see how that all comes out next week. And we will most likely, I don't know, it depends on how far we get, but maybe we'll get to the next little division, the 12 tribes. The number 12 is next on our little chart. We are right there at hello, the name tag, and maybe we will get to the 12 tribes next week, but we will see. Thanks for joining in. If you have any questions, comments, want to discuss anything, want to contact me or the church for any reason, please feel free to do that. If you're watching on YouTube, you cannot comment on the video. I said this multiple times, but the way that the channel is set up, you can't leave comments on YouTube. But if you hop over to Facebook, to our Santa Fe Baptist Church page on Facebook, you can easily find our church there. It's Santa Fe Baptist NM, New Mexico. So hope you have a great week, and we will talk to you next time.